She led her only cow to market. The animal that fed her, clothed her, was her entire world. She sold it for a single reason: to save the life of a man she had never met. In that moment, an elderly grandmother with nothing chose to give everything. And because she did, a story that began with an ending would, years later, rewrite both their lives forever. Her name was Alma, and in her village, a cow was not just an animal. It was a bank account, a grocery store, a retirement plan. To sell it was to sentence yourself to hunger. Yet when they brought the unconscious stranger to the clinic door, she saw a reflection of her own son, lost years before. And so she asked the one question that would define everything: what is a life worth? The village of Quabnia knew two types of silence: the peaceful quiet of dawn and the heavy, waiting silence of hardship. Alma lived in the second kind. Each morning for over 40 years she rose before the sun. Her day began not with an alarm, but with the soft lowing of the brown cow she called Nana Ya. The ritual was sacred: draw water from the well, pour it into the chipped clay bowl, watch as the animal drank, its throat working steadily. Then the milking. Her hands, wrinkled and strong, moved with a rhythm older than memory. 2 liters, sometimes 3, that milk was everything. Half she would sell at the roadside for a handful of coins. The other half became her own supper, often mixed with a little millet. Nana Ya was not a pet. She was a system. A fragile, beautiful system that kept one 68-year-old woman from disappearing. The clinic at the edge of the village was a place of last resort. A single room made of crumbling concrete block, with a rusted metal roof that screamed under the afternoon rain. It was run by a community health worker, Kofi, a man with kind eyes and perpetually empty shelves. He stocked painkillers, antiseptic, bandages. For anything serious, a broken bone, a high fever, a mysterious collapse, he had to refer patients to the district hospital 30 miles down a road that washed away twice a year. The hospital required payment up front. Always, for the people of Quabnia, a medical emergency was not a health crisis first. It was a math problem, and the numbers never worked. The stranger arrived at the clinic on a Thursday, carried on a makeshift stretcher by 2 motorcycle taxi drivers. They had found him on the main road, slumped beside a luxury sedan with a shattered windshield. He was well-dressed, a tailored suit now torn and dusty and unresponsive. His breathing was shallow. Kofi took one look and felt the familiar dread. This was beyond him. He checked the man's pockets. No identification. Just a wallet containing over 2 million cedis in cash, a sum unimaginable in Quabnia, and a single business card for a holding company in Accra. "We must get him to the district hospital immediately," Kofi said. The drivers shook their heads. Their motorbikes couldn't carry him that distance. An ambulance would take hours and cost 200,000 cedis. No one had that. They looked at the cash in the wallet. A silent, terrible calculation began in the room. Word travels fast in a small village. Alma heard the whispers at the communal borehole. A rich man from the city, maybe dead. His car is beautiful. She finished filling her bucket and walked slowly toward the clinic, not out of curiosity, but out of a habit formed from loneliness. She often visited Kofi just to hear another human voice. When she peered through the open doorway, she didn't see a rich man. She saw a face. It was the angle of his jaw, the set of his brow. It was the exact likeness of her son, Quame, who had left for the city a decade ago promising to return, and who had vanished into silence. Her breath caught. It wasn't him, of course. This man was older, but the resemblance was a physical blow. Kofi was on the radio, his voice strained, trying to get a signal to the district. "I need an ambulance. I have an unconscious male, possible head trauma." Static crackled back. The man on the cot moaned, a low sound of pure distress. Alma stepped inside. "What will happen to him?" she asked. Kofi put the radio down, defeated. "Without the ambulance fee, the hospital will not admit him. They will let him lie in their corridor until he dies. It is the rule." He gestured to the wallet. "This money is not for me to take, and even if I did, it is not enough. The deposit they will require, it is more." Alma moved closer to the cot. She looked at the man's face, so like her Quame. She saw the expensive watch on his wrist, a glittering thing that could probably buy 10 cows. But here now it was worthless. It could not summon the ambulance. It could not pay the gatekeepers of medicine. The man's chest hitched, his breathing growing more ragged. Kofi listened with a stethoscope, his face grim. His lungs are struggling. He may not have hours. The 2 drivers had left, unwilling to be entangled further. It was just Kofi, Alma, and a dying stranger. This was the pressure point of an entire system. In cities, wealth is fluid, digital; in banks, in assets. In Arma's world, wealth was living, breathing, and tethered to a post. Her wealth had a name, and it was Nana Ya. She knew the numbers by heart. The cow's milk brought in about 15,000 cedis a week. The cow itself, at market price, might fetch 4 million. It was her pension, her security against the day her hands could no longer work her small vegetable plot. To sell it was to willingly step off a cliff. She did not decide heroically. She decided desperately. The ghost of her missing son hovered in this stranger's face. The clinical, crushing math of the hospital deposit left no other variable. "How much does he need?" Arma asked, her voice strangely calm. Kofi sighed, quoting the impossible figure, 5 million cedis just to be seen. Arma nodded slowly. "Nana Ya will bring 4, she said. "I have one saved in a tin beneath my floor. You will take him." Kofi stared at her, comprehension dawning with horror. "Arma, you cannot. That cow is your life. And this is a life," she said, pointing to the man. "Today it is more urgent than mine." The transaction was swift and brutal. Arma walked back to her compound, her steps steady. She took the rope and tied it around Nana Ya's neck. The animal followed her trustingly, as it had for a decade. At the small weekly market, she found a butcher from the next town. He examined the cow's teeth, felt its haunches. He saw the determination in the old woman's eyes and offered 3.8 million. She did not bargain, she took the cash. When she returned to the clinic, the afternoon sun was blazing. She combined her life savings with the cow money and placed the stack of bills into Kofi's trembling hands. "Go now." Kofi, moved to tears, hired a private minibus for an exorbitant fee. As they carefully loaded the stranger into the back, Arma reached out and touched the man's hand once. "Fight," she whispered. Then the vehicle kicked up dust and disappeared down the road. The silence that returned to Arma's compound that evening was of a new, profound kind. There was no gentle lowing to greet the dusk, no warm animal presence. There was only an empty post and a bowl that would remain dry. She sat on her stool, watching the sun set, feeling a hollow coldness spread beneath her ribs. She had traded certainty for a blind chance. She had saved a ghost. And as the first pangs of real hunger, not the familiar ache, but the sharp fear of what tomorrow brings, began to twist in her stomach, she wondered if she had just signed her own death sentence. But in the district hospital, under bright lights, a different story was flickering to life. The 5 million cedis worked like a magic key. The stranger was admitted, scanned, and rushed into surgery to relieve swelling on his brain. The business card in his wallet had yielded a phone call. And in an office tower in Accra, 500 miles away, a man named Samuel Bokai received the call that his older brother, the billionaire investor Michael Bokai, had been found. He had been missing for 3 days, following what was now believed to be a carjacking. He was alive. In the sterile quiet of the intensive care unit, a fortune was being spent to reassemble a life. In a silent compound 200 miles away, a fortune was running out. Michael Bokai, the man on the cot, was a phantom in 2 worlds. In the world of business news, he was a titan, a billionaire who had built a digital payment empire that moved more money than some national banks. In the world of Quabnia, he was simply the man whose breath had cost a cow. For 12 days, he hovered in a medically induced coma, his brain swelling controlled by drugs that cost more per hour than Arma had earned in a year. His brother Samuel was a constant presence, a man whose tailored suit looked alien against the hospital's cracked linoleum. He had questions that no one could answer. How did Michael end up 200 miles from his scheduled route? Why was his car found with the airbags deployed, but no police report filed? And who had paid the 5 million cedis that got him through the hospital doors? Samuel's investigators hit a wall. The luxury sedan's onboard computer had been wiped clean. Security camera footage from the nearest town showed nothing. It was as if Michael had simply vanished from one place and materialized, broken, in another. The only lead was the money itself. The hospital administrator, a pragmatic woman named Doris, presented Samuel with a receipt. The deposit had been paid in cash, a massive, unusual stack of bills. She remembered the community health worker from Quabnia who had brought the patient and how he had counted the money with trembling hands. When Samuel's team tracked down Kofi, the health worker broke down in tears. He was not a criminal. He was a man burdened by a secret that was too heavy. He told them everything, about the stranger on the road, the impossible hospital fee, and the old woman who had sold her soul to pay it. He gave them Arma's name. Meanwhile, in Quabnia, Arma's world was contracting day by day. The 1 million CDs from her tin was for true catastrophe, a funeral, a roof collapse. She now dipped into it for food. The villagers knew what she had done. They brought her small gifts, a yam, a few eggs, but their own poverty limited their charity. Their admiration was laced with pity, and behind her back, they whispered the word everyone was thinking, foolish. She had traded solid, four-legged certainty for a ghost. The hunger was no longer a distant threat. It was a daily companion. She reduced her meals to one a day, then to one every other day. The flesh began to fall from her arms. She would sit for hours, staring at the empty space where Nana Yah used to stand, listening to a silence that felt like judgment. Back in Accra, Samuel Bokai stared at a photograph of Arma, taken by an investigator from a distance. She was sitting in front of her hut, a wraith in a faded dress. The report stated she had no family, no income, and had liquidated her only asset to save a man she did not know. Samuel, a man who negotiated multi-million-dollar contracts without blinking, found himself unable to comprehend the math of this sacrifice. He instructed his lawyer to draft a document, a grant of 10 million CDs to be given to the woman, no strings attached. It was a thank you, a rounding error in his brother's accounts, a way to clear a moral debt and move on. But something about the photo, about the sheer, illogical weight of her action, gnawed at him. He decided to deliver it himself. Pivot came not from the investigation, but from Michael's slowly returning consciousness. As the sedatives were reduced, he began to stir. Fragmented, nightmarish memories surfaced, not of the crash, but of what came before, a meeting, an argument, the taste of something bitter in his whiskey, the face of his chief financial officer, a man named David Mensah, swimming into view, cold and calm, as Michael's vision began to tunnel. It wasn't a carjacking, it was an attempted murder, a corporate coup. Michael had discovered irregularities in the company's offshore accounts, a slow bleed of funds engineered by David. He had confronted him. The planned business trip had been a trap. David had drugged him, staged the crash, and left him for dead in a remote area, assuming poverty would finish the job. Samuel was shattered. The enemy was not a faceless thug, but a man who sat in their boardroom, a man they had trusted for 15 years. This changed everything. It meant David believed Michael was dead. It meant the company was now in the hands of a killer who was quietly consolidating power. And it meant that the only people who knew Michael was alive were in this hospital, the health worker Kofi, and an old woman in a village David had never heard of. Their knowledge was now a lethal liability. Samuel cancelled the flashy cashier's check. A public transaction would be a beacon. He called off the investigator visiting Quabnia. Instead, he arranged for Michael to be moved to a secure, private clinic under false name. The mission shifted from gratitude to survival. They had to protect the fragile thread of Michael's recovery, and they had to protect the two people who had, without knowing it, become the only witnesses to a crime that high finance was about to bury. David Mensah, meanwhile, was acting. He called an emergency board meeting, citing Michael's prolonged and unexplained absence. He proposed a vote for interim leadership, with himself as the obvious choice. He was days away from legally seizing control of the empire Michael built. In Quabnia, a different kind of stranger arrived. Not a businessman, but a well-dressed woman driving a modest car. She claimed to be from a rural charity, conducting a survey on elderly nutrition. She asked pointed questions about recent emergencies, about clinic visits, about sudden changes in asset ownership. She was polite, but her eyes were calculating. Kofi, suspicious, gave her vague answers. When she left, he ran to Arma's compound. That woman was not from any charity, he told her, breathless. She was digging. Someone is looking for the man you saved, and they are not his friend. Arma felt a chill that had nothing to do with the evening air. Her sacrifice had not ended a story. It had pulled her into the middle of one. That night, Samuel Bokai stood in the private clinic, watching his brother struggle to form a word. Michael's eyes, clouded with pain and drugs, finally focused. He gripped Samuel's wrist with a weak hand. His voice was a dry rasp, but the word was clear. Who? He asked. Samuel understood. Who saved me? Samuel leaned close. A grandmother in a village. She sold her only cow to pay the hospital. Michael closed his eyes. A single tear traced a path through the stubble on his cheek. He was silent for a long time, processing the impossible equation of his life against a cow. When he opened his eyes again, There was a ferocity there that the coma had not erased. He whispered two sentences that would change the course of everything. Find her, protect her, then we take everything back. 2 days after Michael Bokai whispered his command, a team of 3 men arrived in Quabnia. They did not ask questions, they watched. They were Samuel's hand-picked security detail, former military, dressed in plain clothes to blend in. Their mission was simple: establish a protective perimeter around Arma without alarming her or the village. They rented a room in a spare hut at the edge of the settlement and set up a rotation. Their commander, a man named Boateng, introduced himself to Kofi as a relative from the city, sent to check on his elderly aunt. It was a thin story, but it allowed them to be present. They brought bags of rice, cans of milk powder, and protein bars, which they gave to Kofi to distribute to Arma gradually so as not to overwhelm her. For the first time in weeks, Arma ate a full meal. She did not know why this sudden bounty had arrived, but she accepted it with quiet gratitude, her pride long since worn away by hunger. In the private clinic, Michael's recovery was accelerating from a crawl to a walk. The fog of trauma and sedation was lifting, and with it came a razor-sharp, burning rage. He spent hours on a secure laptop, his hands still shaky, reviewing financial records his brother had smuggled out of the office. The scale of David Mensa's betrayal became horrifically clear. It wasn't just embezzlement. David had been setting up parallel companies, siphoning millions into shell corporations in Dubai and Singapore. He had also been negotiating a merger with a rival firm, a merger that would hand over controlling interest and make David the new CEO. The board meeting to approve it was in 9 days. Michael's entire life's work was about to be legally stolen. "He's not just a thief," Michael said to Samuel, his voice low and raw. "He's a gravedigger. He's burying me and dancing on the plot." But David Mensa was not a man who left loose ends. The charity investigator, a private detective named Akosua, had filed her report. An elderly woman in Quabnia had sold her cow to pay a massive hospital bill for an unidentified man. The timeline matched Michael's disappearance. David connected the dots with cold efficiency. If Michael was alive, he was vulnerable, and the woman who saved him was a witness who could link Michael's survival to a location. She was a liability. David's solution was not corporate. He called a number he had used only once before for a problem in a mining concession. He authorized a different kind of transaction, a cleanup. In Quabnia, Boateng's team noticed a new vehicle, a battered pickup truck with tinted windows, parked under a tree at the village entrance for 2 days. No one got in or out. Using binoculars, they saw a man inside, watching, taking photos with a long lens. This was not a curious local. Boateng called Samuel. "We have a second set of eyes, professional. They are scoping the village." Samuel's blood ran cold. David had found them. The protective mission had just become a defensive one. "Do not let them near her," Samuel ordered, "under any circumstances." That night, Arma awoke to the sound of goats bleating in panic. Then a muffled thud and a sharp cry from the direction of Kofi's clinic. She sat up, her heart hammering. Before she could move, a shadow filled her doorway. It was Boateng. "Do not make a sound," he whispered. "Come with me now." He guided her out the back, through her small vegetable plot, and into the dense brush behind her compound. From the darkness, she saw 2 figures approaching her hut from the front. They carried long, heavy objects in their hands. Boateng's 2 teammates emerged from the shadows, intercepting them. There was a brief, violent struggle, more grunts and impacts than shouts. It was over in less than a minute. The 2 intruders were subdued, bound, and dragged away. Arma trembled violently. "Who were they?" she breathed. Boateng's face was grim in the moonlight. "Men sent to make sure you never tell your story." The "wait, it gets worse" moment came not from the village, but from the digital front. The next morning, as Samuel was coordinating with lawyers to plan a legal blockade for the board meeting, his assistant rushed in with a tablet. A major financial news site had just published an explosive story. The headline read, "Missing Billionaire Michael Bokai Sought in Fraud Probe." The article, citing anonymous sources, claimed that Bokai had been embezzling company funds and had fled the country to avoid arrest. It included fabricated transfer records and pointed to his disappearance as evidence of guilt. David Mensa was quoted expressing his deep disappointment and concern for his friend, while vowing to stabilize the company for its employees and shareholders. The narrative had been flipped. Michael was now the villain, and David the heroic steward. The public, and more importantly, The board would see any attempt by Michael to return as the desperate act of a criminal. Michael saw the article and let out a sound of pure fury. "He has poisoned the well," he said. "If I walk into that boardroom now, they will call security before I can say a word." Their evidence against David was solid, but it was complex, buried in spreadsheets. David's story was simple, salacious, and already published. In the court of public opinion, they were losing, and with the board meeting in 7 days, time was now their fiercest enemy. Samuel made a decision. They had to evacuate Arma. She was no longer safe in Quabnia, and her presence could be used as a pawn, but Michael disagreed. "If we move her in secret, we play into David's story. We look like we are hiding a witness. No, we bring her into the light. We make her the center of the true story." It was a colossal risk. It would put a frail, elderly woman at the heart of a billion-dollar corporate war, but Michael was adamant. "She stood in the light when she sold her cow. We will not hide her in the shadows now." A plan formed, desperate and theatrical. They would not wait for the board meeting. They would force a confrontation on their own terms. Michael would give an interview not to a financial paper, but to the most-watched national television news program. He would tell the entire story, from the poisoning to the roadside, from the cow to the cover-up. And he would do it with Arma by his side. Her testimony, her simple, undeniable sacrifice, would be the shield against David's lies. It was the only thing powerful enough to cut through the noise of scandal. Samuel was terrified. It put every piece in the open. But he agreed. They had 1 week to prepare a dying woman for the spotlight, to gather irrefutable evidence, and to stage a comeback that would either save everything or destroy it all. The transition to the endgame began with a quiet conversation. Boateng, sitting with Arma in the safe house they'd moved her to just outside the village, explained the situation as simply as he could. "The man you saved, his name is Michael Bokai. The men who tried to hurt you work for the man who tried to kill him. Michael wants to tell the country what you did. He wants you to help him tell the truth." Arma listened, her old eyes wide. She thought of her empty compound, of Nana Yar, of the gnawing hunger. She thought of the face that looked like her son's. She nodded slowly. "I have already given my cow," she said. "I have nothing left to fear." Her quiet courage in that moment became the foundation upon which a billion-dollar empire would either be reclaimed or shattered. The battle was leaving the shadows and moving into the light, and at its center stood a grandmother who had asked a simple, devastating question: what is a life worth? The answer was about to be decided in front of the entire world. The studio lights were hotter than the midday sun. Arma, in a new blue dress that felt foreign on her skin, sat very still on the plush sofa, her knotted hands folded in her lap. To her right was Michael Bokai, looking every bit the billionaire again in a sharp suit, but paler, thinner, with a faint scar visible on his temple. To her left was the country's most famous news anchor, Nana Akua, known for her piercing interviews with politicians. The audience was silent, waiting. This was not a pre-recorded segment. This was live, primetime television. David Mensa, watching from his penthouse, allowed himself a smirk. He was prepared with a press release labeling Michael a desperate liar. He expected a messy, emotional spectacle that would further discredit his former boss. He was wrong. Nana Akua began not with the fraud allegations, but with a single photograph projected on the screen behind them. It was a picture of Nana Yar, the brown cow, standing in Arma's compound, taken by Kofi months before. This, the anchor said, her voice quiet in the hushed studio, was Arma's entire world, and she sold it to save a stranger. "Mr. Bokai, is this true?" Michael turned to face the camera directly. "It is true, every detail. I was poisoned by a man I trusted, left for dead on a roadside 200 miles from here. I would have died there, but a community health worker named Kofi and this woman, Arma, refused to let that happen. He then did the unexpected. He did not launch into corporate details. He asked the anchor to play a short, raw clip from a security camera at the district hospital, time-stamped the day of his admission. It showed the administrator, Doris, refusing to accept the patient until Kofi, weeping, poured a stack of cash onto her counter. The amount was counted on screen, 5 million cedis. The clip ended. The studio was dead silent. Then Michael turned to Arma. "Grandmother," he said, his voice breaking with an emotion no one could fake. "Why?" The camera zoomed in on Arma's face, a map of wrinkles and quiet dignity. She did not look at the camera, she looked at Michael. "You look like my son," she said simply, "and I could not watch another mother's son die when I had something to give." That was it. no grand speech, no appeal for justice, just the raw, unvarnished truth of her sacrifice. The effect was electric. In living rooms across the nation, people leaned forward. On social media, the clip of her soft-spoken answer began to spread instantly. Nana Acua then pivoted, her tone turning sharp. "Mr. Bokai, you are accused of massive fraud, of embezzling from your own company. How do you respond?" This was the moment. Michael nodded to his brother Samuel off camera. A new slide appeared on the screen, a complex web of financial transfers, shell companies, and dates. "These are the real frauds," Michael said, his voice now steady and cold. "Orchestrated by my chief financial officer, David Mensa. He transferred $47 million over 18 months. When I discovered it, he tried to kill me. He then used my disappearance to tell two stories. First, that I was dead, and second, that I was a thief. He is in his office right now, preparing to take my company in a board meeting next week." As he spoke, a live video feed from the boardroom of Bokai Holdings appeared on a split screen. David Mensa was there, surrounded by several board members, watching the broadcast, his face frozen in horror. He had not expected this. He tried to stand up and leave, but the doors opened. Two plainclothes police officers, accompanied by Samuel's lawyers, entered the room. The live audio picked up the words, "David Mensa, you are under arrest for attempted murder, fraud, and conspiracy." The feed cut out. The studio erupted. The anchor struggled to maintain order. Michael wasn't finished. He announced that every document, every transaction had been handed over to the Financial Crimes Unit and the Attorney General's office that morning. The board, seeing the live arrest and the evidence, would have no choice. The coup was over. But the true payoff was just beginning. In the days that followed, Michael was reinstated unanimously by his board. David Mensa, denied bail, awaited trial. The news cycle was dominated not by the corporate drama, but by the story of the cow. Armour became a national symbol of selflessness. Michael, true to his word, did not just write a check. He arrived in Quabnia 2 weeks later, not with a fleet of black cars, but in a single vehicle. The entire village gathered. He walked to Armour's compound, where she stood in her old dress, having refused to wear the new clothes any longer. He did not speak to the cameras, he spoke to her. "You asked what a life was worth," he said. "You answered with everything you had. I will now answer you." He presented her with 3 things. First, the legal deed to 20 acres of fertile land adjacent to the village in her name. Second, the architectural plans for a new, fully equipped health clinic for Quabnia, with a permanent doctor and a maternity ward to be named after her. Third, he led a young calf, the spitting image of Nana Yar, from the truck and placed the rope in her hands. "The system starts again," he said, "but this time it will not be so fragile." Armour wept openly, but the final, surprising detail came next. Michael had hired private investigators for a different task. He had them search for any trace of Armour's missing son, Quaim, using the old photo she provided. The investigation, using facial recognition on immigration databases, found him. He was alive. He was working as a mechanic in Lagos, Nigeria, having lost his papers and fallen into hardship, too ashamed to contact his mother. Michael had already arranged for his repatriation, his new documentation, and a job at one of his auto plants in Accra if he wanted it. When Armour saw the recent photo of her son, a grown man with her eyes, she collapsed into Michael's arms, sobbing with a decades-old grief finally released. The repayment was not 1,000-fold in money, but in restored life, in restored hope, in a future built on the foundation of her sacrifice. The story closes its loops. Kofi, the health worker, was appointed manager of the new clinic. The village of Quabnia, once a footnote on a map, now had a sustainable future. Michael Bokai, forever changed, established a foundation funded by 5% of his company's profits, dedicated to paying the medical debts of elderly farmers and providing livestock insurance, named Armour's Covenant. He visits her every month, not as a billionaire, but as a son. The tension of the hook is resolved. The cow was sold, the life was saved, and the reward was not a transaction, but a transformation that rippled outwards, turning a single act of devastating kindness into a permanent force for good. The camera fades on a final image, Armour in her compound at dusk, milking her new cow, the sounds of construction on the new clinic in the background, a smile of deep peace on her face. The story of what a life is worth had its answer, written not in CDs, but in legacy. We tell stories like this not because they are common, but because they remind us what is possible. In a world measured by algorithms and bottom lines, Arma's choice was an equation that made no sense. 5 million CDs for a stranger, a retirement plan for a ghost, and yet that illogical human math is what recalibrated an entire universe. It saved a life, toppled a corrupt empire, and rebuilt a village. It proved that the most powerful currency in any economy is not money, but mercy. The lingering question is not what you would do in her shoes, it is what you are doing in your own. Because you do not need a cow to make a choice. You only need to see the person in front of you as a life and not a problem. In a traffic jam, in a crowded line, in a moment of irritation or haste, the opportunity to be a Kofi, to be an Arma, presents itself in 1,000 small ways. The act of seeing someone, truly seeing them, and choosing not to look away, that is the first and most revolutionary step. Michael Bokai could have written a check and closed the file. He chose instead to build a legacy. He understood that repaying a sacrifice is not about settling a debt, but about honoring a principle. And in doing so, he transformed his own story from one of surviving a betrayal to one of championing a cause. The foundation he built, the clinic that now stands, the son who came home, these are not endings. They are new beginnings, planted in the fertile ground of one woman's impossible gift. So now, as this story closes, I want you to pause for a moment. Look at the time on your screen, remember where you are, and ask yourself this: what is the one thing you hold that feels indispensable? Your security, your comfort, your plan, and then imagine, just for a second, being willing to give it up for someone you've never met. That imagining is the spark. That is the seed of a different world. If this story reminded you that hope is a verb, that kindness is a force that can bend the arc of any story, then do not let that feeling fade. Share this with someone who needs to hear it. Like this video if it moved you. And most importantly, subscribe and stay with us. Because we are dedicated to bringing you more stories that don't just pass the time, but that change the way you see your own power. The next chapter of humanity is written every day by people just like you, choosing to write it with compassion. Be one of them.